stick around for all of them. Good morning. The Lord be with you. It is good to be with you again this morning as we continue our walk through history of the church and saints and sinners. I'm trying to do too many things at once. There we go. We are going to look this morning. We're going to open up with a song, but before we do that, I want to talk about where this song comes from. You've got my clicker, could you advance to the next? Yeah, thanks. So today we're going to talk about broadly, just seeing where are we headed. We're going to talk about the rise of Islam, the rise of the Franks, specifically Charlemagne for a little while, but then also we're going to talk about Charlemagne's advisor, educator, his teacher, Alcuin. And then we're going to open up to some questions. I've gotten some questions from some of you as well. We're going to open up the class last 10 minutes or so. If you have questions from anything you've been listening to, I know some of you have been traveling, and it's the first time you've been with us in a little while. So we are excited you are here. So our first song this morning, or our opening song, is from Theodulf of Orleans. This is all glory, laud, and honor. So Theodulf knew about the pomp and honor accorded to kings. He was exiled from his homeland of Spain, possibly because of the invasion of Islamic Moors, and he became a favored member of Charlemagne's court. In 800, he was appointed the Archbishop of Orleans by the future Holy Roman Emperor. And Theodulf also knew how fortune and favor can suddenly turn, how one can plummet abruptly from public acclaim to rejection and condemnation, because in 817 he was accused of conspiring in a rebellion against Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's son and successor. He was divested of office, thrown into prison, and that is where he wrote this hymn, in prison. A familiar Palm Sunday processional, it honors another who was, of course, by turns vindicated and vilified, and who by his resurrection and ascension was ultimately vindicated as the one true king. So you can see here, this is a beautiful image that I found. This is a mosaic from around 806 in the apse of a private prayer chapel that was made for Theodulf of Orleans. So we are going to sing together as our opening prayer, all glory, laud, and honor. Let's see how this goes. All glory, laud, and honor to the Redeemer King, to whom the lips of children made sweet hosannas ring. Thou art the King of Israel, thou David's royal son, who in the Lord's name comest, the King and Blessed One. All glory, laud, and honor to the Redeemer King, to whom the lips of children made sweet hosannas ring. The people of the Hebrews with palms before thee went, their praise and prayers Glory loud and honor to the Redeemer King, to whom the lips of children made sweet hosannas ring. Amen. Something's wrong with one of those keys. I kept fumbling over one. It's not even... we'll figure that out later. Thank you, choir, who's just walked out to help us sing that song. All right. Brian, thank you. If you want to pass me back the clicker, I will continue. You can go get ready for service. Thank you, sir. All right. And so we move on to talking about the spread of Islam. So here we are in the 6th, 7th century. And you can see here, right, we've seen a lot of these maps in the last several weeks. And something's going on in a very different part of the world. Here we've got something going on down here in Medina and Mecca that spreads out stage by stage. You see the conquest of Muhammad in 622 to 632, here in the dark green. The lighter green is the conquest of the first 4 caliphs, 632 to 661, all the way out here into India, all the way halfway up through Africa, northern Africa, and then you've got the latest conquest from 661 to 900, and you see them all the way in Spain. We'll come to talk about this a little bit more later, but my goodness, all the way to France, and then they get turned back, right? They don't make it all the way into Europe. They get stopped here and turned back. But there is a period of time, over 700 years, where a good majority of Spain is controlled by Islamic Muslim forces, especially the Moorish influence right here from Morocco. So this is kind of where we're headed. And of course, as you can imagine, as we've been talking about, this is where Christianity developed. They went north, they went east, they went south, they went west, and Islam did a lot of the same things, a lot of the same movements. So a lot of conflict came about after the rise of Islam. Okay. So normally at this point, I would show you a picture of the person we're talking about, but we don't have pictures of Muhammad. It is not something that is done, right? You've probably heard news about people having representations of Muhammad in comics, and problems occur. Let's just say that. So this in iconography, Islamic iconography it's actually not iconography at all. The art is more calligraphy based. So you see a lot of beautiful calligraphy, and of course it's all in Arabic script. But this is Muhammad, the messenger of God. These are inscribed on the gates of the Prophet's mosque in Medina. So Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born in the year 570. He emerged in his hometown of Mecca in around the year 610 as a preacher of divine revelation that he felt called upon to pass on to his fellow Arab tribespeople. Although the form of these revelations, which were a strongly rhythmic rhyming prose, the Quran, derived from the pronouncements of older Arab seers, Muhammad denied belonging to their number. As he saw it, God, which is Allah, a contraction of Al-Ilah, the God, Allah wanted to impart through him in Arabic and to Arabs the same revelation God had given to the first man, Adam, through Abraham, Moses to the Jews, and then through Jesus to Christians. Now, of course, that is their self-understanding broadly. Obviously, I'm using very broad strokes. We're talking about Islam in 10 minutes here. We're not going deep. But the point is that Muhammad broadly believed that he was returning to the earliest revelation, and some have suggested that perhaps Islam became clouded and changed, Judaism and Christianity became clouded and changed the original revelations, Islam was a return in some ways to the earliest revelations of God. And this is Allah in Arabic. So I had to look all these up. I don't know what all of them are still, even though I read all about them this week. But I think it's beautiful to look at. Arabic script, I think, is lovely. Of course, we've talked about how monotheism had already spread throughout much of the Mediterranean in the Middle East, and so it wasn't as much of a hurdle to jump from polytheism to monotheism, because monotheism was already there, right? So Islam already had a good foundation in that respect. Islam respected the recipients, though, of those older revelations, calling them the people of the book. Accepting monotheism, even that of older revelations, is denoted in the Arabic verb aslama, which means submitting to God's will, from which come the noun Islam and the participle Muslim. Muslim means one who submits. And this comes from the Encyclopedia of Christianity. So, going back to the contents of the oldest revelations that Muhammad and others received, it was a proclamation of the one creator God, and there was also this threat of judgment for unbelievers and wrongdoers. So with the support of a community around him, some immigrants, he founded a theocratic community in Medina, and he was able to seize Mecca in the year 630, removing idols and turning it into a pilgrimage site with the Kaaba at the center of religious life. So the Kaaba, and I might be saying this wrong, I'm not quite sure actually, the Kaaba is a building at the center of Islam's most important mosque, and it's this black box here. The most important mosque is called the Masjid Al-Haram in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. It's the most sacred site in Islam and considered by Muslims to be the Beit Allah, which is the house of God. And it's the Qibla. It is that direction of prayer to which when Muslims pray, they have to go in a certain direction. They can't just pray any which way. They pray towards a certain place. This is that place to which they pray. So here, I thought this was an interesting contrast here. Within a Muslim person's life, they are to make a Hajj, which is a pilgrimage, to this site. But of course, COVID last year shut this place down for the first time as far as we know, in history. And so this is a socially distanced Hajj back in July of 2020. That is not a lot of people when you compare it to what it normally looks like. Whoa. Yeah. That's from 2018. So I think the contrast is quite stark here. So under the third caliph just being a successor after Muhammad, his name was Uthman, the proclamations of the Prophet Muhammad, which had been handed down orally, some in writing, they were all collected into a canon. And the Quran, which just means a reading, recitation, received its final form and became the community's most important standard. Under Caliph Umar, the Islamic community began to expand by force beyond Arabia to subjugate great portions of the Byzantine and the Sassanid Persian empires. With larger cities, usually represented by their bishops or local princes, the Islamic generals concluded and made treaties of surrender that guaranteed the safety of the persons and property of the inhabitants. It guaranteed the unhindered practice of their religion, so it actually guaranteed religious liberty, and it also guaranteed the possession of their houses of worship. So this is the earliest stages of Islam, and we can talk about Islamic extremism in the modern era that doesn't seem to hold to these things. But in the earliest days of Islam, they upheld the safety of people, religious liberty, and the possession of their houses of worship, which I thought was an interesting thing. In return for these liberties, those people had to pay a tribute, and this is a practice based on the Quran. Now, Islam has no missionary command, not like we have with go into all the world. Islam does not have that same missionary command. There's never been a systematic mission, especially to other higher religions, but mission to pagans, for example, in Central Asia or Africa, is always the work of individuals or small groups of Islamic followers, and those people that would go doing those things would be the Sufis and dervishes. And then, as we can imagine, come on, don't tell me the battery's dead. Oh, no, it's not. Well, Dan, the battery's still working because I still have that thing, but it may just be stuck on something over there. Oh, something came up on the screen. If you could you pop, it says Zoom has been logged out. If you could just get me back into PowerPoint, that would be great. So, competition between the faiths of Islam and Christianity was present from the very beginning. Within a decade of the death of Muhammad, in the year 632, the prophet of Muslim armies had conquered a huge part of the ancient Christian heartland, including Palestine, Syria, and Egypt. For centuries, Islam and Christianity were the faiths of competing expansion as power blocks, each of which saw military success as signs of divine favor. Therefore, in spite of intensive cultural exchanges, the prevalent attitude was one of hostility. There we go. Thank you, Dan. So we could talk here. We return to this map now, and in this era, we're talking about the rise of the Franks. We're talking about Charlemagne in particular. And how do these two interact, right? The westward move of Islam played a critical role in the history of Christianity. We've seen already, we've been talking about how there's this west and east divide between the Roman Empire. It's already strained at this point, right? And here comes along Islam, and Islam is going to be one of those, another nail in the coffin to the unity of the East-West church here. The Christian world is still anchored, though, by Rome in the west, Constantinople in the east. As a consequence, the geographical heart of the Mediterranean, or of Christianity, remained in the Mediterranean. Greek is still the language of choice for refined theological discussion, and missionaries like Augustine in England seemed nearly irrelevant, so far out from the center of Christianity and Christian thought and power. But when Islam starts moving west, everything changes, right? Everything is, initially, Christianity is set around the whole Mediterranean, but when Islam expands, the center of Christianity likewise shifts because of it. Despite internal disputes in the mid-7th century, the westward tide of Islam seemed irresistible. Attacks began on Constantinople, still a vigorous imperial capital, back in the year 674. By 698, Carthage, the home of Tertullian and Cyprian, both of whom we've mentioned in this class, that place in Carthage was in Islamic hands. With Carthage under control, Islamic natives fanned out to subdue the eastern Mediterranean. And in 711, Islamic forces bridged this gap between North Africa and Europe. Under the powerful Umayyad dynasty, they crossed Gibraltar. And within a decade, Muslim armies had crossed the Pyrenees Mountains, which separate France and Spain. So a lot is going on, and as we're starting to get into Europe here, and as you see with this funny arrow, they're turned back. They try, but they are turned back. So the precise impact of this Muslim expansion on Christian history has been a matter of contentious debate for a long time, but there's still a consensus that exists on at least several aspects of the big picture. How did Islamic expansion affect Christianity? Largely, we can agree on at least 3 points. So the spread of Islam eastward over Egypt and North Africa was made easier by the weakness of Christianity in those regions. Heavy taxes were imposed by Constantinople, as well as plundering armies from Persia, made the North Africans ready for new rulers. They didn't like the rulers that they had. They wanted something new. So the centuries also of Christian infighting, which we've talked about a lot here, which combined strife over doctrine with wearisome contests for power, further undermined the internal strength of the Christian community. And some historians have even speculated the Egyptian preference for forms of Christian theology stressing the unity of God, like monophysitism. In Egypt, they were predisposed to believe about the unity of God over the threeness of God that perhaps predisposed North Africans toward a radical monotheism of Islam. Also, the spread of Islam accelerated the visions, as we said here, number 2, between the Eastern and Western forms of Christianity, especially because it made communication a lot more difficult. If you go back to this, right, when you can easily go from here and you're in Christian region here, it's not all too hard to go to Alexandria or to go to so any Christians that are still out here, it's easy to communicate with, right? But when Islam comes in, it's a lot more treacherous and difficult to communicate across those lines. And the most important, for Charlemagne's coronation as emperor in the year 800, the expansion of Islam turned the attention of the papacy from the East, right? He's all concerned about the Eastern Christianity, and now that they're really being pushed out, he's now starting to say, what's going on up here? Because I can't do a whole lot about what's going on over there, so let's go north. And that really focused the Pope's attention. And this geographic refocusing signaled willingness to give up the ideals. The ideal was to have an entire Mediterranean Roman Empire. And instead, he said, let's have a new Roman Empire in the north. So the spread of Islam had the most important impact imaginable in the transition of Western Christianity from a Mediterranean, Eastern-oriented faith to an expressly European, northward-looking form of religion. This Islamic context enables us to understand these dynamics that lead to Charlemagne's appearance and rise to power in the year 800. Okay, let's see if this is going to work. Maybe. Here we go. It's not the best video there is, but it's a video. Continuing to talk about the spread of Islam. Wow, some exciting music to wake us up, right? So as you can see, there was, Christianity, we've been talking about a lot in the last several weeks, how Christianity, especially in the early centuries, it's easy to see, develops in relation to something else. It's not so often that someone comes out and says, I think we're going to do this. And it's always in relation to, I don't believe that, I'm not sure what I believe, but I don't believe that. Or, whoa, some outside power is coming and we've got to figure out what to do. No longer can we hold on to this ideal of a Mediterranean Christianity, and now that's changed. The world's changed. We need to think about something else. And so we're forced by outside forces. We are pushed into new arenas of belief, how to live out the gospel. And so that's generally, in big, broad terms, I think that's really how we as a church function, broadly speaking. In relation to many outside forces, we figure out, what do we do? How do we move forward? Now we're going to transition to talking about the rise of the Franks. This is Charles Martel. He is the grandfather of Charlemagne. He was part. So there's the Merovingian kings, the Merovingian dynasty, and then the Carolingian are those of Charles, right? Dynasty in his house. So there's this transition in this era from the Merovingian kings to Charles Martel, who starts off as the mayor in the palace, but he takes on this role and becomes the effective ruler of the Franks. He was a commander who successfully led the Franks in the year 732 against the Islamic Saracens at Poitiers, a high water mark of Islamic expansion. So as I understand it, that arrow that we saw in France, I think it was him who helped push back Islamic expansion, right? Otherwise, France would also have been under Islamic control. It would take more than 7 centuries then for Muslims to be driven completely out of Europe from the Iberian Peninsula, but the tide had begun to turn. While it's possible to exaggerate the decisive influence of this one battle, it's also true Charles Martel, along with his successors, came to be seen as one of the saviors of Europe. So he wasn't, from the beginning, he wasn't king. He was just this mayor, but he was this savior. He's seen as a very important person at this time in history, and so he was elevated. And he kept taking on more and more power with things he was doing and by things he was saying. And he even had the support of the church in many ways. On the ecclesiastical side, he took steps with far-ranging consequences, such as early in his career, he initiated some friendly approaches to the popes. And he's talking to them as if he were the leader of the Franks, and in fact, as well as in power. So he's talking to someone as if he is in charge, and they start to believe, you must be in charge if this is how you're talking to me. And this is what we're talking about. So from Charles Martel, we move down to his son, Pepin the Short. And in 751, Pope Zacharias sanctioned the election of Pepin the Short as evidence, sanctioned the election of Pepin the Short as king of the Franks in replacement of that decrepit Merovingian line, right? This is that transition from Merovingian dynasty to Carolingian dynasty. 3 years later, Pope Stephen II crowned Pepin as king, the first time such an action had ever taken place. In exchange, Pepin extracted Rome from its last lingering tie to Constantinople. Rome is still around, right? I know we just talked about the fall of Rome. Rome is still there, just not the same people are not in power. And here, these people start coming along and elevating Rome once again, because Rome had this, it was almost like a utopia. At a certain point, especially following the fall of Rome, people said, oh, Rome, why? That was when we were really those were the good old days. So anyone who wants to say, make Rome great again, they say, I'm your guy. We're going to do this. And so multiple people over these centuries say, I am the new ruler of Rome. Well, no, you're not. But they're trying to reclaim that former glory that is long gone by saying these things. And Pepin starts to focus in on Rome and start to elevate Rome, and cuts off some of those ties to Constantinople. He also bestows on the Pope a special donation, which gives the Pope control of some Italian territories, which Pepin had won. So he's really, really making sure that he is on good in the Pope's graces, right? Not only is he really lifting up Rome, but he's giving them some control, giving them some power and some land, and the Pope is not rejecting these advances, right? Okay, then we get Charlemagne. I just love this picture. I don't know what it is about it, but the colors or something. It's one of my favorite images I found in this whole class. But Charlemagne, of course, is the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Not the Roman Empire, that's long gone. He is resurrecting the Roman Empire with the authority of the Pope, and he becomes the first emperor of this newly formed Holy Roman Empire. He eventually succeeded the alliances that his grandfather, Charles Martel, had initiated and his father, Pepin, had developed. And from the beginning of his rule as king of the Franks, Charlemagne acted in concert to expand his own power and strengthen connections with the Pope, just like his father had done. By the time he came to Rome in the year 800, his success against the Saxons to the north and east, the Spanish to the west, and the Lombards to his south, had made him lord over more of Europe than anyone since Theodosius at the end of the 4th century. Remember back in 395, we had that great graphic we were looking at a couple weeks ago. Theodosius had ruled from east to west. He was the last one to do so. And then no one else had controlled so much land over Europe until the year 800. So over 400 years, nobody even came close to Theodosius until Charlemagne. And it was on Christmas of the year 800 that he was crowned by the Pope as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So I know there's a lot here, and it may be hard to see from your seats here, but this is the growth of Frankish power. We've seen a few of these charts before. We like to think in nations and states, especially in the modern era, but we impose those on the ancient world and to our detriment, because there are all these little groups and tribes of people that aren't quite states. That idea is anachronistic in this age. They are just people groups, but they live in a broad area of land. So here, the Frankish territory back in 481 is the darkest green. You see Austrasia. I actually don't know how to say that. There's other conquests here, but you can see some names you might recognize: Aquitaine and Burgundy, Provence, the Lombard Kingdom, Bavaria. You may recognize some of these. And then you get Saxony up here to the north. Pay attention to Saxony. So this was an interesting thing that Mark Knoll does not talk about at all, but I thought worthy of lifting up in relation to Charlemagne. He goes into, Dixon in Bullies and Saints talks about Christian jihad, which I thought was an interesting phrase and something interesting to talk about as we talk about the rise of Islam and the rise of the Franks, Christian jihad. So Dixon, basing his work on many other scholars, would say that something changed in Northern Europe in the late 8th and early 9th centuries under Charlemagne. Already during the Merovingian kingdom under Clovis, right? This is centuries earlier, the one that, Merovingian to Carolingian. It was normal for missionaries to follow after military conquests. So you'd go in, you'd fight everybody, they'd be defeated, and then who would come up to clean up the mess? The missionaries, right? They tend to the wounded, they would preach the gospel, and they would try to convert everybody. It was an odd dynamic. They would also establish monasteries and churches in the new lands from which they could launch preaching and charitable missions among those pagans. The Carolingian kingdom, like Charlemagne, inherited this policy, with a couple of major differences, because Charlemagne felt that it was his duty to bring salvation wherever God gave him dominion, right? So it's my job as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, emphasis on holy. Charlemagne says, I've got to go bring salvation to those heathens. Among the Saxons, we'll come back here. This is Saxony up here in the north, the Saxons. Among the Saxons, Charlemagne adopted what has been described as Christian jihad. The Saxons were a Germanic warrior people in northwestern Germany. Charlemagne waged a brutal 30-year war and campaign against them from 772 to 804. So before he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor to after. He was crowned right almost at the tail end of that. And by then, 804, the Saxons were subdued and they were also converted. One scholar saying it this way: Saxon religious conformity was secured through a chilling maxim: baptism or death. Whoa. So that's how they were converted. I'm not sure about that kind of conversion, right? Baptism or death. And adding insult to injury, Charlemagne immediately imposed on every Saxon household tithes, religious taxes, creating a double blow: cultural destruction and this financial yoke. And this indeed has all the hallmarks of Christian jihad, which this Yitzhak Hen of Hebrew University, his stimulating article on the topic is entitled Charlemagne's Jihad. Whew. Okay, so that's somewhere that Noel does not go at all, but I think it's helpful because what I so appreciate about John Dickson's book is that it really doesn't just paint the rosy history, it also looks at the darker history we'd much rather ignore. Charlemagne did a lot of good things. He maintained the Christian empire and Christendom in this era against Islamic forces and strengthened Christian Europe, but it was at a great cost. We're going to finally move on to talking about someone called Alcuin of York. Has anyone ever heard of Alcuin? I'm so curious. Of course, the historian in there. Good. I'm glad, Jay. Good, but the only one. So I'm glad to be teaching you about Alcuin then. So for those of you who don't know, may I do this for a minute? Is that okay? Okay. So this is Jay and Elisa Case over here in the corner. Well, we're so glad they're here. And Jay is going to be teaching in January and February this very class, especially on post-Reformation and global saints and sinners. So we're excited that Jay is here. So I'm always a little nervous to teach because I've got a PhD in history right over here, and I don't even have a major in history. So, but we are glad that you are here. Okay, getting back to Alcuin. John Dickson, it's no surprise that only one of you have heard of him, because John Dickson calls Alcuin of York perhaps the greatest European you've never heard of. He was a biblical scholar, clergyman, poet, teacher of the liberal arts, and at the invitation of Charlemagne, he became a leading scholar and teacher at the Carolingian court, where he remained a figure in the 780s and the 790s. So this is again before Charlemagne becomes emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, but while he is conducting that siege on the Saxons up north. He was, according to Einhard's Life of Charlemagne, right? So Einhard writes this book about Charlemagne and mentions Alcuin, writing that Alcuin was the most learned man anywhere to be found, which I think is a little bit of an ironic thing. Is you're writing a biography about Charlemagne, you talk about a side character, and you say, he was the smartest guy around. Okay, back to this guy. The contrast is, I find a little funny. Okay. Alcuin is considered among the most important intellectual architects of the Carolingian Renaissance, and among his pupils were many of the intellectuals from this era. So we have two important letters from Alcuin in which he attempts to convince the court to revert to a policy of persuasion regarding spreading the faith. And in 796, when he's absent from the royal court, Alcuin tries to modify Charlemagne's approach towards the Saxons and toward the newly conquered fellow courtier Meganfrid, quite a name that is, hoping he would act as Alcuin's go-between to the king. Alcuin reminds Meganfrid of the entirely voluntary nature of the true faith and writes this: first, the faith should be taught, and thus the sacraments of baptism understood, and then the gospel teaching should be delivered. A person can be drawn into the faith, not forced into it. Even after people have received the faith and baptism, their weaker minds should be offered gentler commands. So a person can be drawn into the faith, not forced into it. So this is one of Charlemagne's most important, most learned advisors, saying, I'm not really sure that you're doing the best thing. Forcing people, baptism or death, that's not a good policy here. People cannot be forced into faith. People should be drawn into faith. Alcuin had a second line of approach because in that same year he wrote a much shorter letter directly to Charlemagne, raising the same concerns. And one specialist of Alcuin described that Alcuin was the only person who could contradict Charlemagne. Wow. Even still, Alcuin began modestly with flattery. He praises Charlemagne for his concern for the salvation of the world. And then, as Yitzhak Hen, the guy who wrote about Charlemagne's Jihad, Yitzhak Hen writes, Alcuin drops the bomb slowly and very carefully. Mission is not about coercion and extracting tithes, but persuasion through gentle teaching. Now, and this is a quote from Alcuin here. He writes, now in your wise and godly concern, may you provide good preachers for the new people, sound in conduct, learned in the faith, full of the teaching of the gospel, intent on following the example of the apostles in the preaching of the word of God. For they gave their hearers milk, that is gentle teaching. New converts to the faith must be fed on gentler teaching, as babies on milk, lest minds too weak for harder teaching vomit what they have imbibed. Careful thought must also be given to the right method of preaching and baptizing, that the washing of body and baptism be not made useless by lack in the soul of an understanding of the faith. Oh, we actually had it up there. Okay. So again, he's trying to say what this general policy of forcing people to convert, not so great. We need to take a different tact. And he does drop the bomb, but very slowly, very carefully, and is Charlemagne's only critic, really. But besides being a critic of Charlemagne, there's a whole lot more about Alcuin. He was known as a learned man, a teacher, and this was demonstrated in many ways. We're not going to get there yet. Your cathedral had adopted the educational philosophy known as wisdom theology, which is one of the coolest things that I have read about in a long time. Wisdom theology says that God made the universe through his genius, through his wisdom, and as a result, the world functions not in a haphazard manner, but in accordance with deep, rational principles, which, by God's grace, our trained human wisdom can discover, at least in part. In practice, this educational perspective means learning about God's world is in itself an act of worship. I love this. I'll say that again. It means that learning about God's world in and of itself is an act of worship because it is searching out the signs of God's own wisdom imprinted on creation and learning about the motion of the planets, animals, logic, and so on was a fulfillment of the ancient biblical command. Love the Lord your God with all your mind. That's wisdom theology. And so as a result, the education at York was very broad. It wasn't just theology. It was a lot more broad, taking in grammar, logic, mathematics, music, and astronomy. And obviously, astronomy has come leaps and bounds since the year 800, since the late 700s, 8th century here. But one source here, I didn't even put this in my notes here, but apparently it became all the rage that all the ladies of the court became amateur astronomers. And because of this love of wisdom, they looked up in the heavens and saw God's handiwork and said, I want to know more about that. And I just thought that was a neat side thing here. But this educational focus is not just on the elites. Poor children also sometimes attended these Carolingian schools. There was even educational legislation in the year 789, which mentions children of servile condition. Yikes. And Charlemagne's biographer, Notker of St. Gall, himself a product of Alcuin's school system, reports that the king personally ordered poor children to go to school. On occasion, he even showed up to check on their progress. I mean, the principal coming to your classroom is scary enough, but can you imagine the emperor coming to check if you've done your homework? Whew, that would be a little scary. The king would turn up at school and review the children's letters and poems. And at one of these inspections, it's said that the children of low rank outdid the nobles, quote, with all the savors of wisdom, more than anyone could have hoped for. So what was the king's response? He rebukes the wealthy children for their laziness and pleasure-seeking. And one child from that poor cohort actually became later elevated to a court secretary and writer. So Charlemagne is a complicated figure. There's lots of good and there's lots of bad. It's not easy to say he was one or the other. These are one of those sinners and saints. And Alcuin's relationship to him helps us uncover that there's a lot more to Charlemagne and his empire and era than if we just focused on Charlemagne. And then finally, the classical education movement in the U.S., if you've ever heard of a classical school, a classic education in the U.S., it is modeled on Alcuin's framework. 1,200 years ago, he had the framework. Still, classical education is based on him and his work. Alcuin also demanded the highest quality handwriting from his students and fellow scholars. I imagine he probably had a ruler or two. And it might not sound like much until you Google Carolingian minuscule and look at the images of some of the most beautiful and uncannily recognizable script, right? Now, some of these are a little not as easy for us to recognize, especially because it's in Latin. But this became the basis for Times New Roman. And if you've ever written anything on a computer, you'd use probably Times New Roman. It's probably the default font on your word processor. And so you've got Alcuin to thank for Times New Roman. All right. We've got about 10 more minutes. I'm just going to zoom here through our takeaways and then move on to questions. So the rise of Islam affected the spread and strength of Christianity, especially in the Middle East and in North Africa. We had this move from the Merovingian Empire and dynasty, which we didn't talk about a whole lot, but especially the move towards the Carolingian dynasty which Charlemagne is really at the helm there. We talked about how Charlemagne fortified the church and the state, but also created this strange dynamic and strange relationship with Christian jihad. And then we were glad to find out that there were some voices that spoke against those forced conversions, like Alcuin. And we learned a little bit more about love of learning and wisdom theology, which is probably one of my favorite takeaways from this section. And the idea that we can love God with our mind by learning about everything. I love that. Okay. So we've got about 10, I don't know what's going on with the clock up there. It's 5 minutes, 6 minutes fast. And it's also like 6 degrees off kilter. I don't know what's going on with it.
10:07.
Yeah, it's 10:07, but something's going on up there. So anyhow, questions. I didn't have enough time last week for any questions, so if you have questions from last week or this week, Dan, start us off.
No, this is a confession.
Uh-oh.
I have 3 of these bags. Last week there was a handout, and Michael gave them to me because we got out late. Well, guess what? I picked up the wrong bag today. Michael's handouts are safe. They're secure. So
From
if you
Al-Haram.
come back next week, you'll get last week's handout. There's the enticement to return.
There we go. Come on back.
And I apologize.
No, thank you, Dan. Appreciate letting us know there. Are those handouts helpful? I don't know if you go back and reread them and say, what did I learn today? If it's helpful for you, I'll keep doing those. If you just toss them in the bin when you get home, okay, I see a few hands that are saying keep going with it. So I'll print out 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, I'll just print them out for everybody. Great. All right. Questions then on, so next week you'll get 2 weeks worth of handouts because I don't have one for today. All right. Yeah, go ahead, Dick.
When we were visiting Spain, we understood that the Muslims have been kicked out of there. What time period would that have been, do you know?
So it was an incremental thing. How historians love to actually give a date, or non-historians love to force the historians to say, give me a date, what's the final date? 1492 is the date of the Reconquista, and that's the final date where the Moors are kicked out, but it is sequential. There's several stages. So from 711 through 1492 is the general era. So over 700, almost 800 years where there is Moorish, if not domination, Moorish presence in Spain. So you can still go to Spain today, in the south especially, see a lot of Moorish influence. I was a Spanish major a century or two ago, and we learned all about this stuff. So it was interesting to study it from another angle. I studied the Moors from the Spanish angle, not so much from the broader. Southern Spain still has a lot of influence, especially architectural influence. And there was a beautiful era in Spain where especially in southern Spain, where Christians, Jews, and Muslims all cohabitated peacefully for a good long while. It was this really beautiful testament to what can be done when people choose peace. Spanish, just because I know it, I'll add this in here. Spanish has about 5,000 words that come from that we use that come from Arabic because of that Moorish influence. So, a lot of interesting historical things here. Thanks for the question, Dick. Yeah. Anybody else? I've got some other questions that people have sent me, so if you don't have questions, I can go to those. Okay. Go ahead, Mike.
So did Charlemagne change his approach to evangelism?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't remember. I don't know. I'll have to go back and look. Mark Knoll doesn't talk about this at all. So this really comes in just in John Dixon's book. So I'm not sure. I'll have to look into that and get back to you. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Sue.
Well, it seems like that it's a contest between submission and exploration or learning. And Islam says submit or else, which is also what Charlemagne did. But then Alcuin goes back to what Israel means, which is the struggle, which is what you're going to do if you're going to explore. So it really comes down to doing or being. It's a struggle. It's a human struggle.
Yeah.
We feel so good when we do things and
Right.
got to accomplish things, but the being thing can, the I am.
Yeah. The being versus doing. I like that. Yeah, no, I do think, especially in the earliest era of Islam, there was the way that Islam is portrayed in the media today is pretty much just extremist Muslims and the extreme form of what you were mentioning ago of convert or die. But in this earliest era, that's not at all what's going on. Sure, there are battles. Sure, there are incursions and difficult conflicts. But by and large, at this time, Islam is still promoting religious liberty and freedom for a price. So the or else is not necessarily or die. It's or pay us to maintain the peace in this time. Islam means submit. It also can mean like perfection or it has like 6 different ways it could be translated in English. Yeah, so it's a lot. Okay, feel free to raise any other hands. I've still got another 3 minutes to answer the easiest of questions I got by emails. One question came, some of these are from Beth Pansino, Prosper Pansino, and she writes, in the last couple of weeks we've talked about the debates and quarrels about the nature of Jesus. Why is it up to us, and how can we as humans possibly understand what God has done? With our limited knowledge of how things work, why should there be a debate about the nature of Jesus? So we didn't talk about that today in class, but that's been a constant theme, right? You remember that quadrilateral, that was it was the picture of rectangle, whatever it was. Jesus is God, right? One person of the Godhead. All those ideas about how do we define Jesus and Jesus' nature, human, divine, and God, and also one of the Trinity, right? How do we do this? The place that I land on this, I think it's important to know about these early debates, and I certainly think it's important to be familiar with, to know about these debates. But at the end of the day, I'm with Beth that I don't think we can truly know everything about Jesus. The Gospels only take us so far. And while I certainly think that Jesus is human and divine, and Jesus is the Son of God and Son of Man, how? I don't know. And so to start excommunicating people in the church and that's not our era. We don't get it as much. But as we talked about a couple weeks ago, Athanasius, his whole ministry was about combating Arius and Arian ideas. And Athanasius, he really understood that without it, if he did not hold the line, that the church was going to fall. And with that kind of an understanding of what you're doing, that kind of constructive theology, but also responsive theology, responding to what others are saying and believing, you've got to really hold on firm to this thing. I don't know if that, it certainly made him more steadfast in his belief, but did it perhaps cloud him could he ever step back and say, I don't really know either? I don't think he could. I think there's too much on the line at that era. Okay. I have a few more questions here, but I'm seeing that it is quarter after. And so we are going to talk about next week. We're going to talk about just a few things. The Great Schism, Filioque Clause, the Crusades, all in an hour. It'll never happen, but we'll try. We'll try. It's a lot to talk about. And we're going to finish with, we're going to finish with a prayer from Alcuin, which I so appreciate. So let us go. Oh, come on. I don't know why I did that. Boop. Okay. Let's pray. Eternal light, shine into our hearts. Eternal goodness, deliver us from evil. Eternal power, be our support. Eternal wisdom, scatter the darkness of our ignorance. Eternal pity, have mercy upon us, that with all our heart and mind and soul and strength we may seek thy face and be brought by thine infinite mercy to thy holy presence. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. And we say together, Amen. Thank you all. We'll see you in worship.
Adlin.